Welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping right into what was arguably the first and maybe the most explosive organizational crisis of the entire early church movement.
It really was. We're talking about the fallout from Paul's first missionary journey.
Right, across what we now call Turkey.
Yeah.
And it was, by all accounts, a huge success. I mean, thousands of Gentile converts.
A monumental success. Gentiles were just flooding into the faith. They're receiving the Holy Spirit. God is clearly accepting them. And then Paul gets back to Antioch of Syria.
And that's where the growth creates this huge theological clash.
Yeah, a specific group shows up. The sources say they were from the party of the Pharisees, but they were also believers in Jesus.
And they arrive with one single, non-negotiable demand.
That's right. They insist that if these new Gentile converts want to be saved, they have to follow the entire Mosaic law, circumcision, the ceremonies, all of it.
Their concern was basically, how will these people know how to live? They thought without that structure, the whole movement would be, I don't know, polluted.
Exactly. For them, the law of Moses was the only way to guarantee moral purity and really legitimacy.
This was obviously way too big to solve locally. So Paul and Barnabas, they get a delegation together and head to Jerusalem.
Straight to the top, to James, Peter, and the apostles. The whole mission was to get an answer to this one daunting question.
What are we going to do? And more importantly, how do you theologically justify freeing Gentiles from this heavy religious yoke, as the sources keep calling it?
I mean, the text says there was much debate. You could just feel the tension in that room. And then finally, Peter stands up.
And he just cuts right through it all.
He does. He basically stands up and says, look, let's just remember what God has already done. He chose me to preach to the Gentiles.
He's reminding them of Cornelius, the whole story.
The whole story. And he says God himself made no distinction between us and them. He cleansed their hearts by faith, not by works, not by law, by faith.
So his point is, God has already voted. The case is closed.
That's the foundation of his argument. And then he brings out the rhetorical hammer. He asks, why are you putting God to the test by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear?
Wow. Okay, that word yoke, it just sounds heavy.
Yeah.
We think of a farming tool, but for that audience, what did that word really land with?
Oh, it wasn't just physical. It was existential weight. The yoke was the symbol of being bound to this entire system of rules and rituals.
Not just the 10 Commandments.
Not at all. We're talking about the 613 laws, the purity codes, the constant sacrifices. It was a system that, as Peter says, was virtually impossible for anyone to perfectly keep.
And he's basically saying, we've been failing at this for generations. Why would we force this crushing burden on them?
Exactly. When God has offered a better way. And he lands the plane by saying, our salvation and theirs comes through the grace of the Lord Jesus.
Which just blows the whole idea of salvation by rule keeping out of the water.
Completely. And it worked. The sources say that after he spoke, all the assembly fell silent. It was a total mic drop moment.
So let's stick with that word yoke, because it seems so intentional. Peter has to be echoing Jesus' own words here, right, from Matthew 11.
Oh, absolutely. Jesus' famous invitation. Take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
And that's where it gets complicated because, you know, being a Christian doesn't always feel easy or light. There's persecution, suffering, making hard choices.
Martyrdom even. Yeah, it feels like a contradiction. How can the yoke be easy when the call is to take up your cross, which sounds incredibly heavy?
So how do we square that circle? How can both be true?
I think we have to look at the specific context Jesus gives. He frames his light yoke as a kind of exchange. It's not that there's no burden, it's that you're trading a heavier burden for a lighter one.
Okay, so what's the first trade?
The first one is the yoke of sin versus the yoke of righteousness. Right before Jesus gives this invitation, he's just been denouncing cities like Chorazin and Bethsaida for their unrighteousness.
So he's talking to people who are worn out.
Worn out, but maybe not from trying to keep the law. They're worn out from living against God's design.
So the comparison isn't easy versus doing nothing. It's easy versus the crushing weight of a destructive life.
Precisely. I mean, think about the yokes we put on ourselves. The bitterness of unforgiveness that just eats you alive. The debt and broken trust from addiction or infidelity. The guilt.
Those are heavy, incredibly heavy burdens.
And Jesus is saying that following his way, living within the boundaries he lays out, like in the Sermon on the Mount, It might seem hard, but it actually protects you from the far heavier weight of self-destruction.
So sin is fun for a season,
But winter is always coming. Christ's yoke is easy because it saves you from that devastation. In that sense, it's a profound relief.
which connects directly to the second context. This brings us right back to Peter, the yoke of legalism versus the yoke of the Spirit.
Yes. Right after the light yoke invitation in Matthew's gospel, what happens? The disciples are walking through a field, and they start plucking grain to eat because they're hungry.
On the Sabbath, a huge no-no for the Pharisees.
They see it as unlawful work, but Jesus defends his disciples. He says he's Lord of the Sabbath and that God desires mercy and not sacrifice.
He's pushing back against the man-made traditions.
All the hundreds of extra rules that had been piled on top of the law, making it this impossible, anxiety-inducing burden. Jesus is demonstrating freedom from that.
So the light yoke is a double freedom. It's freedom from the weight of sin and freedom from the anxiety of legalism.
And that gives Peter's argument in Acts 15 its full power. It's so much easier to walk in the Spirit, guided by love, than to try and check off every single box in a rule book that no one could ever perfectly keep anyway.
Okay, so the scene shifts back to Jerusalem. Peter has spoken. Paul and Barnabas have given their testimony. Now James, who is really the central leader of the Jerusalem church at this point, he steps up to give the final ruling.
And he confirms it. He says they should not trouble the Gentiles with the full Mosaic law. The theological fight is over. Salvation is by faith.
He doesn't just leave it there. He gives them a list of 4 things to abstain from. The apostolic decree.
Right. No food polluted by idols, no sexual immorality, nothing that has been strangled, and no blood.
And that raises a question. If the yoke of the law is gone, why add back 4 new rules? Isn't that a little contradictory?
It's a great question, and the answer is that these rules weren't about salvation. They were about something else entirely. They were intensely practical.
Okay, so what was the first reason for this specific list? He doesn't say don't murder.
Right. He doesn't need to. Things like murder and theft were already understood as wrong. That basic moral law was written on the heart, as Paul would say, and it was read in the synagogues every week. Everyone knew that stuff.
So this list was about something else.
It was about fellowship,
Yeah.
about koinonia. This decree was designed for one primary purpose: to make it possible for Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians to sit down and eat together.
And sharing a meal in that culture was a huge deal. It was about acceptance, bringing someone into your family.
A massive deal. And for a Jewish believer, even one who followed Jesus, things like eating blood or meat from a strangled animal were, well, they were deeply offensive, absolute taboos. And food offered to idols was directly tied to pagan worship.
So James wasn't listing the 4 worst sins. He was listing the 4 biggest cultural barriers that would stop a Jewish Christian from having a Gentile Christian over for dinner.
It's a brilliant application of love over rights. The decree basically says, you are free from the 613 laws, but for the sake of unity, could you please restrain yourselves on these 4 points so we can actually live as a family?
This whole principle of limiting your freedom for the sake of another person is exactly what Paul digs into later, right, in 1 Corinthians.
He expands on it in incredible detail, specifically around that issue of food offered to idols.
He says, look, some of you have knowledge. You know the idol is nothing, the meat is just meat. You have a right to eat it.
But then he adds that critical line: knowledge puffs up, but love builds up.
Okay, so let's put that in modern terms. I have the right to, I don't know, play a certain video game. I know it's fine for me, but maybe my friend is a recovering gambling addict, and for him, that game is a huge trigger.
That's a perfect analogy. Paul warns that your personal right must not become a stumbling block to the weak, to the person whose conscience isn't as strong as yours. If they see you, the strong one, doing it, it could tempt them to violate their own conscience, and that's spiritually damaging.
And he raises the stakes on that. He says you're sinning against Christ.
He puts it in the most serious terms possible. He asks, is your knowledge worth destroying this person for whom Christ died? His conclusion is that the person with the stronger conscience, the one with more freedom, has the responsibility to limit that freedom out of love for the other person.
So the goal is to walk in freedom, yes, but to always be looking around you, to be intensely sensitive to the people in your community.
That's the balance. The early church managed to hold on to this radical theological freedom, the light yoke, while practicing a profound practical responsibility to each other.
It's just a powerful model for unity. We've traced this whole conflict, we've unpacked the heavy yoke versus the light yoke, and we've seen the principles they laid out for fellowship.
And at the center of it is Jesus calling his yoke easy and light, offering rest and freeing us from the impossible weight of legalism and sin.
And yet, at the same time, his other call to every single follower is, come take up the cross and follow me.
And that's the tension you have to live in. So the question we'll leave you with is this. How do you personally reconcile the difference between the glorious freedom of a light yoke and the undeniable daily cost of the cross?